Welcome everyone to another one of my videos. This time finally building an inexpensive PC, because the last few have been more on the mid-range or higher end of things. And to that effect we start with this thick-watt FN501 Pro NVMe 256GB SSD that I got on Amazon for Prime Day. I simply couldn't help myself and I got a bunch of SSDs, thinking that they're all various 512 gigs, but this one slipped through and instead of returning it I decided to use it here. So it's going to go in this gigabyte H510M motherboard that has a pre-installed i3-10100F. So that is a 10th gen alongside a really beefy cooler and 60 gigs of 2666 Mbps RAM. I don't usually do i3 builds and I was very much tempted to trade this in for a 1050 or thereabouts, but then I decided that this is too much of a good opportunity to do an inexpensive build with the 60 quid or so required to trade up, somewhat spoiling the value proposition. Besides, this i3 might only be a quad core, but it is a modern quad core that will outperform a 7700 in every scenario and run just as well as a 7700K, so it should be more than up to the task. Now, you've obviously read the title to the video, so you know that I will end up putting a Vega 56 GPU in here, but that was not originally the intent. Now, I was planning to use a 1066GB, but because Gigabyte, the company, is incredibly craptastic at writing BIOSes, the 10 series card simply is not compatible, nor are any cards below Nvidia's 20 series or AMD's RX Vega series, which is frankly embarrassing. I ended up putting all of these in an M-ATX case with a VS550 PSU from Corsair and some non-RGB fans for intake. Unfortunately, the board only has 12V RGB and all I have is one fan that supports that, which I use for the cooler, plus some LED strips that I have pre-installed on the sides. Yeah, it's a very cramped case, but every GPU contender for this build is a blower style one, and for all the faults those coolers have, they do have the advantage of not spewing hot air back into the case, rendering the actual size of the case kinda irrelevant. So this is the GPU that was going to go in there, a 6-pin equipped GTX 1066GB that would have been probably the best match for this build. Instead, I ended up using this Vega 56 blower style that takes two 8-pin PCIe connectors. I will go into a bit more detail in the benchmarking section, but suffice to say that this GPU is a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde. Even comes complete with a dual BIOS switch that goes between a more moderate BIOS with 135, 150 and 175 watt presets, and the very aggressive one with 150, 175 and 210 watt presets. Regardless of which one you use, Afterburner will let you unlock it to its maximum 225 watt board power. I have played around with this board for a while and now I have come to a very definite personal conclusion. It makes no sense to overclock it or go beyond 150 watts as the power consumption and noise spike, but the performance really doesn't. I would highly recommend just sticking on the power saver feature or put it on balance and just leave it be. One more quirk of this card is that when video editing the core clock spikes to 1800 MHz. Now obviously this is not a 3D workload and is mainly using compute, but the first time that happened was a bit scary because the GPU tachometer thing on the side of the card went all the way to the max and stayed there. I mean, mind you, it only drew about 37 watts, so it's all good. It just goes to show that the Vega architecture is for compute cards first and gaming cards second. And yes, the only reason I noticed this is because I tend to edit all my videos on the PC I am testing to get a feel for what it's like. Yes, I could use my main machine, but I feel somehow that amounts to cheating. Now, starting with Heaven, we get a really good result right off the bat with 124 FPS. This is actually the exact same result I got from a 3050, and I'm torn between praising this Vega or despairing at how bad the 3050 is. Anyway, the good news is that this card can really overclock. It went from 1180 MHz to 1400. The not so good news is that for the 10 or so frames we gain, the board power draw goes from 120 watts to 225 watts, which for a blower style card is loud, and in my humble opinion definitely not worth the trade-off. So for the rest of this video I'll leave it alone, locked at 150 watts silent BIOS. 3D Mark next, and all the stress tests passed and it gave us a score of 5704 in TimeSpy, which is expected considering that we locked this card at 150 watts. Rocket League is the first esports game we will be looking at. While it might not be readily apparent, most of the time we are actually CPU limited here, but 203 FPS on average with both on and max settings is really nothing to scoff at. And no, I have no idea why everything is tinged a weird shade of yellow, it's just another fun artifact courtesy of my cheap capture card. By far, Fortnite provided the biggest pleasant surprise of this whole benchmarking session. With everything set to epic and TSR to quality, we got over 60 FPS and the game looked magnificent. I really did not expect it to do anywhere near as well as it did, especially not in DirectX 12 mode. My expectation was set around 40 to 45 FPS or so. I did try setting TSR to balance, but while we got a few extra frames pushing the average to over 75, on my 34-inch monitor it looked a bit too soft. I'm willing to bet that it would be perfectly acceptable on a 24-27-inch monitor though. It goes without saying that a small reduction in quality settings will go to over 100 FPS easy for competitive play. From this rig's biggest triumph we go to Farcry, aka its biggest disappointment. I had more than an inkling that this will happen before I started the game. The CPU simply bombed with the 68 FPS average being entirely limited by the i3 here. The game though ran very well and the frame time averages were really good. Just a very potent reminder that 4-core CPUs have had their day, even relatively modern ones like this 10100F. There is one other matter to mention here, and that is that my test drive is a complete mess to the point where this CPU is being used at around 40% just to keep the desktop running. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, this returned an average of 85 FPS on Ultra, while the bottleneck hot potato was switched from the GPU to the CPU. While one would think that this is an ideal scenario with the CPU and GPU seemingly being evenly matched, that in reality is not the case. You see, the CPU doesn't actually draw any geometry, it just runs the word thread, NPC AI logic and all of the other stuff that in ideal conditions would have little to no effect on FPS, smoothing everything out by increasing the 1% and 0.1% lows. This though, in this case, is rather academic since the game runs very well indeed. I haven't purchased Mirage yet, so here's the car's performance in Valhalla, which is just as well because it turns 60 FPS on average at very high settings with FSR turned on. I mean, after so many patches, this is finally a game that looks ready for prime time. Pity it took so long the next installment launched. I'm really hoping the Mirage does not follow the same path. I even avoided performance review of it until now. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is still such a good looking game even though it's been a fair few years since its release. 51 FPS on this machine aided by XeSS and looking surprisingly sharp, I'm going to call that a good result and move on before I remember that the story was not my cup of tea, but I still played the game to its conclusion because, well, you know. The penultimate game for today is Forza Horizons that again smashed expectations and pushed out 63 FPS at Ultra, even though the recommended settings for this card are high settings, managing to just about squeeze under the VRAM limit. I mean, for this price point, the gameplay I think most people will agree is awesome. And finally it's Cyberpunk. Left the most demanding for last, but nevertheless I still opted for high settings. Of course there is no RT on offer here. Because this is an AMD card, I chose FSR over XeSS. Is this the best this game can look? Well, no, but the question is it still enjoyable? And the answer to that is a definite yes. I did spend a bit of time running around Night City and the experience was really good, with the frame rate both 1% and the average higher than the benchmark would suggest. Actually closer to 58 FPS than the 48 FPS in the standardized run. I did say a while ago that the 970 is the minimum to play and enjoy this game, but in light of the new GPU prices I'm going to say that it's probably a better idea to sell that 970 on eBay or CX and get yourself a Vega 56. You really won't regret it. Oh, and one more thing, you would have noticed that I did not go on ad nauseum about the HBM memory on this card. Mostly because it's a very neat trick, but at the end of the day, unless you are mining, these days it makes little to no difference in games, good or bad, so for most people this is a moot point. Yes, on this card you can overclock the core and the memory quite substantially. Hell, you can even flash a Vega 64 BIOS for amazing performance uplifts, but at the end of the day, it's a blower style and the warranty has expired a while back, so I would do neither of those things, and instead just enjoy an amazing inexpensive gaming experience. And that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next one.